Hello and welcome to another episode of Spark Talk. I'm joined today by Kasamas Regis and Elizabeth. Kasama is Tagalog for comrade, to discuss what's been happening in the Philippines. Hello, comrades.
Hi.
Hello, kumusta?
Kumusta? How are you?
Yes.
I'm good, thank you. So, for months now, the country has been rocked by a huge corruption scandal. The government of Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte is rather weak and unstable in the face of the huge discontent amongst people. There have been waves of protests in September, with the latest one taking place last week under the leadership of the Church of Christ. And this protest actually brought out over 500,000 people. There's also been some rumors of a military coup. So overall, there's a lot of ferment, but the question is what to do. So today, my aim is to try and help our listeners make sense of what's happening in the Philippines. And as always, what should socialists on the ground be doing? What should they be fighting for? So with that as our aim, I wonder if either one of you could start with a bit of a primer. Like who's in the government? Because obviously the names Marcos and Duterte are well known internationally, but who are these people? Who are the main political forces? And what's generally the state of the Philippines these days?
Okay, I'll start.
Mm-hmm.
The government of the Philippines is led by Ferdinand Marcos Jr. He is the son of the late dictator, also his namesake, who brutally ruled. Also a very corrupt dictatorship between 1965 and 1986 when he was overthrown by a popular uprising. Now, the vice president, they ran on a common ticket called the Uni Team, is Sara Duterte. And she is the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte, who ran a very bloody regime under a death squad. He also administered one of the harshest lockdowns in the world during the COVID pandemic. So both sides have been tainted by this big scandal. Well, Sara Duterte was also tainted by some other scandal regarding confidential funds and intelligence funds.
Can I just explain
Yeah.
confidential? Because nobody knows what a confidential fund is.
Neither do I.
Yeah, this is the thing. It's built into the budget for the cabinet that you have a certain amount of funds, which you don't have to explain what you spend the money for. And the idea is that this is for counterintelligence purposes, right? So think about like fighting against the Maoist guerrillas in the countryside, something like that. But Sara Duterte used the largest ever amount of money for these confidential funds as the head of the Department of Education.
Yeah.
The Department of Education.
So in terms of the corruption scandal, I think there's a point that the Marcos Sr., the Marcos dictatorship was notorious for massively pillaging money from state projects, and taking it out of the country and burying it in Swiss bank accounts or something. Imelda Marcos's insane shopping sprees. The family name is very dirty on the question of corruption. And here is Sara Duterte, the vice president. They've been in a feud. The president and the vice president have been in opposite poles. I think Marcos has an attitude towards the American government that if he does whatever the Trump administration tells him to do, he'll get a good deal for the Philippines, versus the Duterte family has an idea that they can appeal to popular sentiments of anti-imperialism and get a better deal from the Americans that way. So there's been a lot of conflict in the administration over this question. But when it comes to the question of corruption, they both look the same.
In fact, it was like it was like a gangster movie with the vice president threatening to shoot the president's wife, members of his family, the president himself. So they were really going at each other's throats. And so the church that you mentioned, the Iglesia ni Cristo, the Church of Christ, last year they had to mobilize like over 1 million people in the center of Manila to get both factions to stop threatening to kill each other.
Well, that was going to be my next question, because you mentioned the word Regis, unity. So how is it that these two forces came together on a joint ticket to run for office?
Sara Duterte, the vice president, when her father was in office, by the end of his presidency, despite the fact that he really did run, like Regis said, a death squad government, he was extremely brutal and he carried out super repressive lockdowns. He was still very, very popular at the end of his term. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is, I think if you listen to him talk, he's very effective at tapping into the sense of national oppression in the Philippines. People understand how they are humiliated constantly by the U.S. imperialists, and he really was able to tap into this and posture and say, I'm going to be the guy who stands up for the Philippines. But also crime went down. There was a lot of economic development projects that he started, which were very, very popular. So the end of his term, he's popular. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. latches onto that with this idea that he's going to be the development president, and he's going to continue these projects that Rodrigo Duterte had started to develop the country and really grow the economy, but he's going to do it based on borrowing a lot of money
from the imperialists
and getting imperialist investment by basically like being the big labor contractor and selling out the natural resources in the country and making big military bases for the Americans here. So I think that's kind of how the two families ended up in an alliance kind of on this development question against the liberal candidate, Lenny Robredo.
That was going to be my next question. Like, who is the anti-government forces
today? So the liberal opposition is actually in an unofficial.
They're not an opposition.
They're not an opposition. They're called the loyal opposition. They're shielding the government, shielding Marcos himself. They aren't calling for his overthrow. They are very terrified of the vice president taking over government.
There's a big pressure in the country right now that if Marcos falls, I think business establishment and the liberal kind of politicos are very worried if Marcos falls. And the church.
The Catholic Church.
You're going to, and also the INC, I think. You're either going to get a Sara Duterte presidency, which is not very acceptable to the ruling establishment because she's going to piss off the Americans, or you're going to get a military coup, which is not going to be good for business and it's going to create instability. So I think there's quite a significant sector of the elite strata in the country that doesn't want to get rid of Marcos because they think it's going to be a worse outcome for them.
So let's make sense of the anti-Duterte pressures. Like, what's been happening is there's a huge corruption scandal, but people are like, well, we kind of just have to tolerate the guys who's overseeing everything because the alternative is much worse. So let's get into a little bit of what's the state of the country? What is this corruption scandal?
This is about the flood control projects, which the Marcos administration has touted for years. It's supposed to be one of the cornerstone projects. And it turns out taxpayers' money was being invested into these projects and billions of taxpayers' money. And for most part, nothing was being built.
And if I can just interject, I mean, specifically, we're talking like $11 billion US, right?
Right.
And also, yeah. And the other thing is, I mean, just to give a bit of context for flood defense scandals, I mean, the Philippines is absolutely devastated by typhoons. Like multiple typhoons that are deadly for the ordinary people, like throughout the
There's one coming right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is not some like abstract sort of infrastructure project. This was promised as something that could actually help people ward off devastation and death, right? So you have billions of US dollars being pushed into these projects, which ultimately don't happen.
Yeah.
In fact, the point I think where the scandal really broke and became a big deal in the country was when the typhoon season started in July. Of that $11 billion that you mentioned that went to flood control, the estimate is that about 30% actually went to flood control and all of the rest of it was siphoned off. Was looted. What they're talking about is ghost work projects where, there was some kind of bullshit plan.
Just the signs that said, here is the project, and there's no
the contractor. Yeah. But the result was that millions of people were displaced from their homes. And it's been a massive hit to the agriculture in the country,
almost 5 million people were displaced. 300 people died. That's the latest count.
Food prices are already very high, so it's this is really going to be hard for the population of the country.
People are still knee-deep in muck and mire and in flood. Like the flood hasn't receded in some of the towns in Central Luzon, for example.
Yeah. We did an episode on Indonesia recently. There's been all these Gen Z revolutions and so on happening. And a thing that drives or sets off the spark is corruption. And I know in the Philippines, when earlier you were talking about Marcos Sr. and Duterte, et cetera, like corruption is nothing new. But then every so often you get scandals of just horrible proportions that do make it just literally, intolerable for people and make a bit of a crisis for the government. So I guess my next question is, what has been the response from different sectors to the corruption scandal?
Well, most of the people who have been protesting since the scandal broke out are among the middle class and the students. So you'd be surprised. People are chanting in the malls. You have college athletic games, and they're chanting the slogan to like jail the miscreants, like arrest them all, kick them out. All in unison. Even the competing teams have their cheering squads are working together to start the agitation.
What about the government's own response? How have they been handling this?
Marcos is starting to crack down. Actually, his police have been passing out subpoenas. They've been putting gag orders on campus publications. Imagine they're on a witch hunt against real and imagined dissenters. They brought out like maybe at least 10,000 police. They put out a lot of barriers and barricades and fire trucks for the protest.
So to start off with, the Congress made a committee, right, to investigate the corruption.
Right.
And on for about a month. I don't exactly know all the details, but I know there were a lot of people who resigned. There was a lot of sentiment that it wasn't doing anything.
Well, there's something called the Independent Commission for Infrastructure.
But the scandal, it really broke in July, and we're now at the end of November. And it was only in the last 2 days that there were actual arrest warrants issued for anybody, even though everybody knows what had gone down, and that by the time they actually issued any arrest warrant, everybody had already fled the country.
Right.
So the government is really widely seen as just covering up. And it's the elite covering up for their own. Marcos for his cousin Romualdez, who was forced to resign. Marcos came out in this press conference. No, he's not a big corrupt person. There's no reason to think he should be in jail. They're really seen as covering up, and I think it's making people really angry.
Right. Then one of his closest allies, who's in a party list and is in overseas, he comes out with bigger exposés about the payoffs are actually in suitcases of money are being moved from house to house. That's how much money was being moved around.
God. Okay. As you said, Elizabeth, the situation has changed in the last few days. The scandal broke in July. It's now November. And I know up until even a month ago, like nobody was really calling for Marcos out. Nobody was really actually making the protests anti-government protests. But something changed. And with that, also, obviously, the left's posture has changed as well. So what happened to make the situation change?
I think we should start with this point that you mentioned at the beginning of that question about nobody was calling for the government to resign. Because in reality, it was pretty shocking. It was only Sara Duterte, the vice president, and her supporters who were calling for Marcos to resign. And she's the vice president. She's the next person in line for secession. So that looked very self-interested. But if you went to, there are these protests by the Akbayan Social Democrats and the liberals that have been happening every week since the first of these protests. And they have been very clear that they do not want people raising the call for Marcos to resign at those protests.
They just wanted accountability and good governance.
What this looks like to the masses of people in this country is that they're covering up and trying to defend Marcos from popular outrage.
Right.
So that is really a kind of a disgrace, that you're going to cover up for this, corrupt politician and imperialist lackey at that, rather than trying to put forward a different perspective. I think what really shook the situation up, to be honest with you, who had the initiative here was the Iglesia Ni Cristo, the church that called the protest and mobilized 500,000 people in the center of Manila because they were concerned, I think, about instability. They were very clear that Marcos needed to clean up the government, that he needed to act, and that they did not support the Dutertistas, and what they wanted was just the situation to be stable and to have transparent government in the country. But when that started to happen, 500,000 people camping out in the center of Manila.
In the main part.
Yeah, the government got very nervous.
Right, and not just the Iglesia. Because I went to work in a cab and the guy was really angry, the cab driver, and he said he's not even religious. He's not even Iglesia, or he's not even a Dutertista. But he said, I want the government to fall and I'm going to the demonstration. And people at my workplace, they went too. They're Catholics, but they went to the demonstration.
Everybody was looking, there was this idea that this would be an anti-government mobilization, and people were really looking for something like that. So I think that's what kind of pushed Marcos to have to take action. But the other side of that is that it also pushed the left to have to do something, because here's the initiative in the hands of this big mega church. So it was after the very day that rally began, actually, that
that was a Sunday.
Yeah, the
It called for 3 days of demonstrations.
The National Democrats, which is the biggest left tendency in the country, part of the workers' movement, I would say. They, I think, felt so much pressure from this that they came out with a call for Marcos and Duterte both to resign, and to form a transitional people's council to make a government that would really represent the masses in the country. Which was about time, I would say.
They kept shifting, actually, by the day, because they first started out as like Marcos, Duterte, resign. And then within hours, it changed. Marcos, Duterte, resign. And they said, form a People's Transitional Council.
What exactly is a People's Transitional Council?
Well, that is a very good question.
I mean, because it certainly is a good development, right? Like that there's actual forces that are coming out explicitly against the government, and they are, obviously this will also help to win people away from the church. Just like you said, your taxi driver who's not really like a churchgoer, but he's anti-government, right? So it's a good development that there's forces calling for people's councils. But what is it? What do they mean? What do they want with the Transitional People's Council? How is this being received, and what do you have to say about it?
In my personal opinion, what much of the membership wants and what the leadership of the National Democratic Movement wants are not necessarily the same thing.
Okay.
I believe from talking to a number of students, very enthusiastic ND members, that they view this as a step towards socialism, that they think that this should be a government
of the masses,
really a government of the masses that represents the interests of the masses. On the other hand, I think that the leadership of the ND movement is very interested in trying to have an alliance with civil society organizations.
A broad coalition of the opposition.
Right. And the problem with that is, of course, that in this country, if you include the NGOs and you include the liberals, those are first and foremost people who are loyal to the idea of the American empire and U.S. imperialism, but secondly, who are fundamentally opposed to bringing down the Marcos government. So they have there's a problem, I think, for this leadership perspective, that it's going to be a total dead end and impasse and will really destroy this initiative, which I think it's quite important that someone on the left came to put forward a left perspective for a government that's an alternative to the oligarchs or a military coup. So we should say something also about Partido Lakas ng Masa, which is a socialist organization, which has also come up with a call for a Transitional People's Council and for Marcos and Duterte to resign.
Yeah, they're a breakaway organization. It's a rival of the National Democrats.
Obviously, there's the problem of what is this thing actually going to look like? But the other problem is, what do you do to actually get Marcos and Duterte to resign and to have a government that represents the masses? How do you go from here? And the reality is that the National Democrats and PLM aren't really giving any answers to their supporters about how to make this happen. It seems like the congressional bloc is having some kind of negotiations, but if you're a member or a supporter of this idea and you want to do something to make it real, like to bring down the Marcos administration is not an easy task, but they're not giving any answers. All they're saying is come out on protest on Bonafacio Day.
So everyone is watching and waiting, and the masses are also watching and waiting.
But nobody has the initiative, and instead they're just stalling. Once again, it took them forever to actually come out with an alternative as the regime. The church came out first before the left did. And now in terms of what to do.
Yeah, because around the middle of September, the Social Democrats of Akbayan and the National Democrats who are in Congress actually said, we're not here to oust Marcos. We just want accountability.
That's right. It took them
an
entire month after
an entire month or more. And it was because the rank and file were like pushing and pushing and pushing. Actually, the youth came out at this media conference with signs and were chanting for the ouster of Marcos. And the liberals, like clamp down on that. And
the leadership of the ND congressional bloc,
right,
this guy Tino, and Sara
Sara
Elago
Elago.
from Gabriela were extremely explicit that they were at that point not for the resignation of Marcos.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite a change from where the NDs were, a few weeks ago to now. What do you think is their difficulty in terms of really putting forward an answer to how to fight for a people's transitional council? Like, do you think they're themselves clueless, or is this them reacting to the pressure amongst the younger people in their base? Or, how do we make sense of the fact that they've come out with this nice demand, but then they're like, we don't know.
They're reacting to the pressure from the people at their base. And the youth have always, because I used to be around the NatDems and I was in the youth, and we were also always often to the left of the leadership. And the adult leadership was always very conservative. That was back in the 1980s when we wanted to go forward and they said, no, hold it back. So from our conversations with NatDem youth, this is what they've been saying.
I think there's a lot of frustration also because these are people who joined the NatDem movement because they want to see a transformation. They want to liberate their country from imperialism and open the road for communism. To be honest with you, in the future. And what they're seeing is that their leadership, they had to put so much pressure on their leadership to get them to even propose, to be against Marcos and Duterte and propose an alternative. And now that leadership is like a dead weight on this initiative. They finally forced them to do it, but they're not going to leave.
In this entire situation, you guys are pushing for a specific call, which is for a Bayan PLM, which is a Partidos Lakas ng Masa. You're pushing for a Bayan PLM government. So tell us about that and how that actually is a way to push forward the fight for a People's Transitional Council, or just push forward the struggle against corruption in general.
I wanted to make one point about the last question, if that's all right, which is in terms of why is it that the NatDem and PLM leadership are not putting forward a real answer to their membership. Here are the steps that you need to take to make this happen. I think there's a problem because the more that the NatDem base and the PLM base, the working population in this country, the urban poor, the peasants, the students, the more that they rise to their feet and they start to take action to bring down the government and make another government, the more the liberals and the NGOs and that civil society type organizations are going to go over to the side of Marcos or the military or some other thing and oppose that mobilization, because those are all forces that are totally committed to the social order of neocolonial capitalism in the Philippines. And when they feel like their property interests and their privileges are challenged, they're going to go over to the side of the reactionaries. So I think that the NatDems and PLM are kind of stuck because they've been looking for their allies for years and years. They've been looking for their allies in the camp of some progressive bourgeoisie, people like the Aquino family or Lenny Robredo.
Right.
And if you actually bring your people into action to bring down the government, those allies are going to be out the door. So I think that the leadership is stuck in a way.
Right.
They're conflicted. Like, who are you going to answer to? Are you going to answer to your base or are you going to answer to the liberals? This is a conflict for them.
Yeah, that actually is very helpful to understand I get the sense from the conversation that there is a real contradiction amongst the base of the NDs and the leadership, that they're kind of caught in between these two pressures of answering and being receptive to their base, but not wanting to alienate their allies amongst the liberals and the NGOs. So that's helpful. Do you want to come back to the question I did ask about the Bayan, which is the NDs, right? The Bayan PLM government. So tell us what this means. Why do we have this intervention? Help us make sense of it. How did you arrive at it? What does this mean?
This is what is happening. Before, with the left, the Social Democrats and the National Democrats shielding Marcos, it was the right-wing populists, the Dutertistas, or the forces we call the Maisug, the valiant ones. They were the ones who were actually posturing and shouting for the downfall of the government and lambasting Marcos as an agent, a foreign agent, a puppet of the imperialists who wanted to drag the country into a war with China, and that the masses did not want to be part of that war. So This is what the right-wing populists were saying, and it was gaining resonance among the workers and the urban poor, and also the oppressed layers of the petty bourgeoisie. So the left wasn't addressing this. They actually sounded more left. If you went to their demonstrations or listened to their politicians, they actually sounded more militant than the not them leaders or the social democrats. And I wouldn't be surprised why the masses actually look to them as the genuine defenders of the nation against the indignities that we are suffering under the imperialist control and the oppression that we are under by the rule of the political dynasties. And the populists are raising these points. And if we don't raise these points, if the left doesn't raise these points, they are ceding the political terrain to the populists, and the populists are going to draw in the support of the masses. And we need to contest authority among the masses, and we need to project the political leadership of the masses. And Bayan and PLM are the biggest on the left, and they have the support of the most advanced layers of the working class. So it is to them that the masses usually look to. And we need to pressure the leaders to actually do something, because people also expect them to do something. Otherwise, you lose your credibility in the face of what the populists are saying.
What the base of PLM and the Nat Dem movement base wants is they really want their party to be in the government. They want there to be a socialist alternative to the situation right now, an alternative that represents the interests of the masses. And they think that their party is going to do that, and they want their party to do that. So for us, we don't have confidence that their party is going to do that. These are people who capitulated to the ruling elite in this country on every significant question.
Many times.
Since, certainly notably going back to 1986. So we don't have confidence that they're going to do that. But there does need to be a socialist alternative, and we want to help the base of these two parties make that real. And we're going to push to try to make that real. And I'll tell you what, if their leadership does not carry it out, it's going to be a very convincing argument to those people at the base who fought for it, why you need to actually be a Trotskyist and not a Maoist in order to make to be able to make a revolution in this country and liberate the country from imperialism.
Right. So you're putting forward Leninist tactics, basically.
That's right.
In order
That's the long way of saying
it. No, that's really good. But it's nice to see how that's being carried out in the concrete in this situation, because I think from my survey of the left, it's either like, oh, corruption is a problem of capitalism. This is nothing new. You just need a revolution. Okay. So you got that trend in the left. And I think the other trend is, I think, exactly what the NDs are doing, which is dragging their feet, denouncing corruption, in the meantime, not doing much. But okay, so now they've taken a step. But our job is to push that forward, whilst also showing the limitations, I guess, in their ability or their willingness to really fight for it. And I think that the very fact that they've come out with this demand for a transitional people's council, but have really no plan, no actual mechanism with which to make this a reality, I think that's a clear example. As you were explaining earlier, Elizabeth, we'll see. But I think our job, as we see on the ground, is to actually take the sentiment at the base and use that to push the struggle against corruption forward. So that's how I sort of make sense of that, if that you think
absolutely. And I would say, in terms of the tactic, I think it's been really useful, because there's a lot of reasons why Trotskyism has a bad reputation in this country. Not least, for example, the World Socialist website, I think, is the most commonly known Trotskyist organization.
Oh, no.
And they are completely unwilling to stand up against the imperialists, because they're so concerned that fighting for national liberation is a capitulation to the domestic bourgeoisie. So, and they're extremely sectarian in terms of dealing with this huge national democratic movement. So I think the fact that we are able to adopt this different tactic is extremely interesting to people. And I think it's very clear to a lot of members of the Nat Dem movement and to a lot of members of PLM that what we're trying to do, actually what we want, is what they want too. And we have a difference over how to get it. But we're going to work together with them and try and make it happen.
For sure. Now, this is my fault. I didn't really go into this earlier, but the question of national liberation has come up a number of times. I should have posed this question at the start because you can't make sense of the Philippines without talking about American imperialism. And I think we've touched on it throughout. But I've got two questions in regards to this, both of, again, which have been kind of implicit. Because one of the calls you do have when you do raise a slogan for a Bayan PLM government is for national liberation, to break the US-Philippine military alliance and, for American troops out. But the other thing I think relatedly is also like why the fight against corruption needs to be anti-imperialist, why you really can't address the whole disease of corruption without actually without rooting it in like imperialism as a root cause. I wonder if you could actually explain some of that. And the reason I ask this again is you do get those trends in the left that are like, oh, what are you talking about? Like, what imperialist oppression? Or they might recognize it and then they'll still say, well, no, the national bourgeoisie is the main enemy because otherwise you're a Maoist or whatever. My long-winded way of asking the question is, can you help us to make sense of why the fight for national liberation is like really at the heart of the fight against corruption at the current moment?
Well, the bourgeoisie is the creation also of the imperialists. They have always been hand in glove working with the imperialists. Marcos, his government, he's the main henchman of the imperialists. He's their main agent, or he's the labor contractor. So also over the decades, the corrupt system was imposed by the imperialists. They put up like the Principalia. They put the native bourgeoisie in power when the workers and the peasants were not allowed to vote. And what they created was something called cacique democracy. The caciques would, these like local overlords would buy the votes, and in return, they expected to make to recoup their expenses or maybe double and triple what they earn. And the system was built like that. So there was a lot of political nepotism, bureaucratic corruption, and it goes like years and years of that. Plus the bribery by the imperialists in order to get the contracts and stuff. We heard lots of interesting stories about that too.
Yeah. And the first time I was quite taken aback at how much of this country is owned either by the US or the Japanese, the shops, the food in the grocery stores. The US technically doesn't have military bases in this country, but the US military is all over it. The government contractors, the mercenaries, the whole country is just completely being crushed under the boot of the Americans.
Right.
And the reality is that the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class in this country, they're late on the scene. They've always been able to just maintain their position by relying on the imperialists to have their back. There's a wonderful book that Regis recommended by Rene Constantino called The Continuing Past, that it goes through the stories of how the Filipino bourgeoisie, every time the country was occupied by different forces, switched banners to support the new occupation force and be in the new government that was established by the imperialists. This is the whole class. As a class, the bourgeoisie in this country is it's weak, it's corrupt, and it exists as like middlemen between the imperialists who really run the show and the masses of the population of the country. So it's inherently, its whole role is inherently parasitic, and the corruption just goes quite along with that.
Yeah, because they can only get so much from the crumbs from the table. So they want to maximize that, and they go into plunder. So the different factions are like are squabbling over how smooth you can carry out this system, whether it's to be blatant or you just suave.
Yeah, interesting. I appreciate the point about the bourgeoisie, like just switching banners each time a new imperialist power took over. I was watching this documentary on Aquino, and his family goes back like generations. So this is really the problem of the political dynasties in this in the Philippines, and not just the Philippines, not unique in this. But yeah, for sure. One thing I would like to also ask is the working class. We've not really addressed that directly in our discussion so far. So where is the working class at in this anti-corruption movement? My general sense is that things don't look so well for the working class, and that's mostly to do with the state of the economy. I think since Liberation Day, given the sort of turning situation in the world, the economy is getting more and more squeezed, and that's putting the working class in a bad position. It really seems more or less absent as a force. And as you said at the outset, it's really more or less students and the middle class. So how do we make sense of what to do with this situation?
It's been quite striking to see the very, very few strikes that have been going on in the recent period in the country. And those strikes that have been taking place have been very small and very isolated. Yeah, and I agree that the outcome has not been good. So I feel like the working class is under huge amount of economic pressure. The prices are high. Inflation is crazy. Foreign investment is going down. People are really worried, I think, about what their future is going to be like.
They're still rebuilding their homes.
They're rebuilding their homes. I think people are frightened and stressed and anxious. They don't feel confident in a fighting spirit. But I think there's a broader history behind this also, which is like, for example, the first time I came here was a May Day protest. And I was talking to some workers in one of the contingents, and they were telling me about this problem of contractualization, that everybody works for a subcontractor. And if the subcontractor doesn't like what you're doing because you're starting to organize, they just close the shop and either leave the country or move to a different region or, So there's like this real sense of precarity. And I think this is all a product of the union movement having been heavily, heavily eroded in the 1990s when the leadership, rather than trying to organize on an anti-imperialist basis, really dumped the past anti-imperialism and accepted kind of this liberal worldview that free trade and organizations like the ILO and the United Nations would just kind of inherently bring progress to the working class. And the reality is that it's weakened the workers' movement. And now that the U.S. is really bringing down the hammer, the workers are left defenseless and kind of demoralized and without a real leadership that they have any confidence in.
Yeah, that is very true. Last night we were talking to someone who works in the BPO industry, and they find it very, very difficult to even talk about.
Sorry, what is BPO, Regis?
Oh, I'm sorry. The business processing outsourcing industry, like call centers and all that. So in the business processing outsourced centers, these are mainly working for the contracts overseas, mainly American accounts. So during the typhoons and the flooding, the owners of the BPOs of the call centers ordered their workers to report to the call centers in the middle of the calamity. And Elizabeth could say something about that because she personally heard this story from another person who works there.
Oh, yeah. No, it was really horrible. In fact, what happened is there's a kind of it's called the Business Processing Organization Employees Network, BN, is the sort of kind of union organization for the BPO workers, revealed a statement about this. It seems like they went to make a complaint to the government labor and employment department, and the BPOs themselves then issued a statement defending this call on the basis that Filipinos had to risk their life to go to work in catastrophic flooding because they were providing essential services for businesses in the United States. So there's really just like a naked colonial demand in the population of this country.
Yeah. Which is why I'm not surprised why the Dutertistas have a significant hearing among BPO workers.
But the problem is the BPO workers, they all think if we do anything, we're going to lose our jobs. So they don't feel like they can stand up.
And over time, they used to have like better conditions, but over the years, it's all been eroded. And so the wages are very low. Their situations are precarious. The quotas are very high. So it's very tough for them.
That sounds absolutely wretched, demanding them to come in during terrible flooding. But again, I there's so many similarities in terms of other countries in the global south where workers feel that if they fight back, that there's just so much surplus labor, or that the balance of power is just so much stacked against them that the bosses can just up and relocate, or they have no protection, so they can just like mass fire them all. So that's always a huge obstacle in terms of organizing workers when it comes to countries in the global south, and specifically in these types of sectors. So if I step back and sort of try and make sense of our conversation so far, crazy corruption scandal of like gigantic proportions, people sick of it. But what we've seen is protests from huge protest, in fact, from the church. Lots of students are animated by this. Of course, layers of the middle class, working class. Of course, they're on the back foot, but that's not to say that they're not also angry at the situation. But the working class seems to be sort of missing as a factor. And then now you finally have, trends in the left, significant trends, in fact, that are finally going against the government and calling for the government to resign and for a people's transitional council. So that's sort of the picture we've got. And we've got an important day of protests, national protests on the 30th of November. So within this, tell us what you are trying to do to make that successful. How are you trying to build this fight against corruption on the ground in the lead up to Bonafacio Day?
So I can tell you one thing, the one thing that the National Democratic leadership is actually called to do is to come out on Bonafacio Day. Mm-hmm. So we tried to work with that demand. Fine, let's do that. Let's all come out. But the way that the left works in this country is when there's a big holiday, everybody rallies separately.
Right.
And a lot of times the demands kind of sound the same, but there's like every different left group on its own, they're all doing their own thing. It's kind of a mess.
A few meters from each other.
Yeah, counterposed rallies.
And they keep saying the other guy is sectarian.
Yeah, everybody's also sectarian. So this time we thought what would actually make a difference in terms of helping to build up momentum behind these demands for Marcos and Duterte to resign and for Transitional People's Council is if the left for once actually rallied together. Let's bring out as many people and as many forces as we can, and let's demand at that Marcos and Duterte get out. Enough with you guys. We do want the People's Transitional Council, but not just that. We want the People's Transitional Council that's going to actually answer to what the rank and file members of the National Democratic Movement and of PLM want. Right. That is not some sellout concession to Lenny Robredo and Bam Aquino and the NGO movement and Greenpeace.
We want to make sure that the liberals are kept out of the People's Transitional Council. It's not a popular call, but we want to make sure harangan ang mga liberal, block the liberals from sneaking their way into the People's Council, and don't allow the not them and PLM leaders like His Honor Representative Antonio Tino and Attorney Luke Espiritu from selling out the masses because they wanted to get to get in the good graces of these liberal gentlemen and ladies. We don't want that. We say out, no liberals in the People's Transition Government.
The people who don't want to get rid of Marcos have no place in the government to replace him.
Exactly. Yeah, precisely. Okay. Absolutely. And maybe in a second we can talk a little bit more about the left more generally. But okay, so United Front at Luneta. Luneta is a place where this rally is going to happen. And, to cut through the sectarianisms to fight for the left groups to put their petty grievances and whatever else aside and actually focus on the task at hand. Keep the liberals out of the Transitional Council. And then the third demand you have on your leaflet here is push back the reactionaries. Tell us about that one. And I guess we've touched on this a little bit already, but if you can just motivate one more time.
Well, I think that it's really important to answer the scaremongering going around that if you call for Marcos to resign, the answer is going to be either like a Duterte death squad government, like you said, or it's going to be a military coup, and it's going to be the fault of the people who bring down Marcos that everything gets worse. So I think our answer to that is, in fact, things are going to get worse if we don't call for anything. And the best way to push back against the forces of reaction is for us to seize the initiative. Let's not leave it to the INC. Let's not leave it to the military. We need to unite ourselves and be bold and be strong. And the more we can appeal and win popular support, the safer the country is going to be from the oligarchs and from the threat of the military coup.
Yeah. So in Tagalog, magpakita ng lakas at tapang para mahatak ang suporta ng taong bayan. Makibaka, wag matakot. Struggle, don't fear.
Yeah. I really like that point as you explained it, just because I think, again, I have those trends in the left in mind who are like, but no, what are you talking about? You need a socialist revolution. It's like, well, let's be concrete here. You have to actually put something forward as a perspective to struggle now. It's actually how to push the fight for socialist for socialism right now. And if we don't do it, and if we just stand aside and chant abstractly for this and that and the other thing, you're really actually not helping the struggle. You're actually just discrediting the left. So I appreciate that the point really is to seize the initiative, as you said, Regis. So, okay. So those three demands. Tell us a little bit more. I mean, I've been kind of like assuming what the different trends in the left are. I certainly know that the sectarian sort of, I have a bit of a feel for that trend. But tell us about the lay of the land of the left. How are they reacting to this People's Transitional Council demand? What are they saying about what to do now?
Well, some of the questions we've encountered is the young people will come up to you and ask, what next? What next? What are we going to do? Because their leaders are not telling them what to do. You see them on TV, you see them in social media, they have this news conference, but there's no 1, 2, 3, what next?
Well, I wanted to make one point that I thought was actually a positive development. So there's a group in the Philippines called Partido Socialista, which I would tell you my overall impression of this group is that they're pretty liberal. But they put out a statement about the corruption protests, which has some pretty liberal title about constitutional government. But in it, they do actually call for Marcos and Duterte to resign. And they say that they'll support the call for a People's Transitional Council on a number of conditions. But I think they make one totally correct and very important condition, which is that it be fully autonomous of the ruling class. Right. So that I think is a good response to this initiative. From the NatDems and PLM. There's also a number of groups on the left that do exactly, I think, what you're talking about. And their answer is, oh, well, we need socialist revolution. We need a government of the masses down with corruption, which is really no help at all because...
Or worse, they just abstain. They don't want to be part of this fight. It's not our fight. It's just the liberals.
It's only about corruption. We don't have anything to say about corruption. So this, I think, really gives the left a bad name as unserious people who don't have a way to put their ideas in practice. And then there's a third camp that I wanted to mention, which is Kamangagawa type organization, which is got a person in parliament. And as far as I can tell, their activity is entirely focused on trying to make legislative reforms to try to combat corruption. And they've been completely ignoring this PLM NatDem initiative, which I think makes them sound no different than the liberals, to be honest.
In fact, they're trying to win over the support of the liberals for their legislative agenda.
But everybody's going to think that's a joke. I mean, honestly, who believes that you can... The Congress is full of political dynasties and oligarchs. Those people are not going to reform the country to get rid of corruption.
They can't even pass laws to abolish themselves. They won't do that. But these leftists in the Congress, they have this illusion, the leaders outside, the leftist leaders, that you could pressure Congress to pass some laws that will abolish the dynasties when the Congress itself is controlled by the dynasties.
Okay, that wraps up the questions I have in terms of the situation, what's happening. Elizabeth, I know you said earlier that it feels like the country's a volcano. Like,
yes.
It is literally on top of a volcano, but you're not talking. You're not talking in the geological sense. You're talking just in terms of
There's so much. The population is so angry and they're so frustrated and they don't see any way forward. I think it's quite important that the left give this some progressive direction, because otherwise, what are you going to end up with is some rioting or social explosion that just burns itself out and is totally futile and doesn't accomplish anything for the situation of the masses.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that is actually quite important. When there's ferment, it won't stay that way forever. It has to go in some direction. So if you don't fight to channel it in a progressive direction, it will go elsewhere. It's not just good. Like it's a very dynamic situation. So I appreciate that you guys came on, took the time to help us understand what's really going on with this huge corruption scandal. What's the state of the country? And I think, crucially, how to fight for this People's Transitional Councils. I wondered, Regis, if you could just briefly motivate. I want to plug your publication, Talibang Anak Pawis. If you can just tell us what that means, and I'll link it in the show notes for our listeners to go check out.
Talibang Anak Pawis means the vanguard of the toiling people. It also means the tribune of the toiling masses.
Okay, cool. It's an excellent name.
Could I make an appeal before we end the
please.
show?
Go for it.
So there are protests happening not just here in the Philippines, but all over the world around Bonafacio Day against Marcos Duterte, against the corruption. And I really want to encourage our listeners to go out to those protests. And also, to support this initiative, to fight for a People's Transitional Council without the liberals or fully autonomous of the ruling class or whatever demand you want to use, and to demand that Marcos Duterte resign. Because I think the more force we can bring down to bear on this, the more likely there is to be a positive outcome.
Right. Kaya magkaisang hanay tayo kung saan man bakahin ang rehimen Marcos Duterte, ipagtanggol ang bayan, Marcos Duterte, ibasura.
Imperialismo,
ibagsak.
What is that? Do you want to translate?
What I said was united front to struggle against Marcos Duterte, defend the nation, and down with Marcos Duterte and down with imperialism.
Lovely. Well, I think that's a lovely, lovely place to end our conversation. Is that, if that's okay with you? Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Maraming salamat.
Thank you so much for your time. Salamat to you both. And good luck with the protests. Do keep us posted. And depending on what goes down, I'm sure we can plan another episode if the People's Transitional Councils become a reality or something else happens. So do keep us posted.
Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. Salamat.